What happens when one of Hollywood's most outspoken actresses sits down with one of daytime television's toughest interviewers, and a simple question about artistic choices turns into a full-blown confrontation that nobody saw coming? Before we get into this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this whole situation. Because trust me, you're going to have an opinion by the end of this. So Florence Pugh is making the rounds promoting her latest film, and everything seems pretty standard. She's done the late-night circuit, she's done the morning shows, and now she's sitting at the table on The View. The panel is in full swing, the audience is engaged, and for the first 20 minutes or so, everything is going smoothly. They're talking about her new movie, they're laughing about some behind-the-scenes moments, and Florence is doing what she does best, being charming, being witty, being herself. But then, Sunny Hostin decides to shift gears, and this is where things start to get interesting. Sunny leans forward slightly, and you can tell from her tone that she's about to ask something she thinks is important. She says, "Florence, I want to talk about something that's been a topic of conversation in the media lately. You've been very vocal about your choices as an actress, particularly when it comes to the roles you take and how you present yourself. But there are some people, particularly younger women, who look up to you, and they've expressed concern about some of the messages your recent projects might be sending. How do you respond to that criticism?" Now, if you've followed Florence Pugh at all, you know she doesn't back down from these kinds of questions. She's never been one to shy away from defending her work. So she takes a breath, and she responds pretty calmly at first. She says, "I think it's important to remember that I'm an actress, not a role model in the traditional sense. I make choices based on the art, based on the story, based on what challenges me as a performer. I'm not making choices based on whether or not someone thinks I should be setting an example." Sunny nods. But you can see she's not quite satisfied with that answer. She comes back with, "But don't you think that, as someone with a platform, someone who has influence, especially over young women, that you have a responsibility to consider the impact of your choices?" And this is where you can see Florence's demeanor start to change just a little bit. Her smile gets a bit tighter. She says, "I think the idea that women, specifically women, need to be responsible for being role models at all times is part of the problem. We don't ask men these questions nearly as often. When a male actor takes a challenging or controversial role, we call it brave. When a woman does it, suddenly she's being irresponsible." The audience reacts to that. There's some applause, some murmurs, and you can feel the energy in the room shift. Sunny doesn't miss a beat though. She says, "I hear what you're saying, and I agree that there's a double standard, but I'm not talking about men right now. I'm talking about you, and the choices you've made. And I think it's fair to ask whether you've considered the consequences of those choices, particularly when young girls are watching." Florence sits back in her chair, and now you can really see that she's getting frustrated. She says, "What consequences are we talking about exactly? Because from where I'm sitting, the consequence of me doing my job, of me taking roles that are complex and human and real, is that I get questioned about whether I'm being responsible enough. That doesn't happen to my male colleagues." Sunny responds quickly. She says, "The consequence I'm talking about is the normalization of certain behaviors, certain images that might not be healthy for young people to internalize. And I think, as someone who has spoken out about body positivity and self-acceptance, it seems contradictory for you to then participate in projects that could undermine those very messages." Now Florence's face changes completely. The smile is gone. She leans forward and says, "What projects are you referring to specifically? Because I want to make sure we're clear about what you're accusing me of here." Sunny doesn't back down. She says, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking you to reflect on whether the roles you've chosen, some of which involve very explicit content, are aligned with the values you claim to stand for." And Florence just stares at her for a moment. Then she says, "The values I claim to stand for. That's an interesting way to put it. So now we're questioning whether my values are genuine." The other hosts are starting to look uncomfortable. One of them tries to jump in, tries to lighten the mood, but Sunny cuts them off. She says, "Florence, I think you're being defensive when I'm asking a legitimate question that a lot of people have. This isn't a personal attack." Florence laughs, but it's not a friendly laugh. She says, "It feels pretty personal when you're sitting here implying that I'm a hypocrite. You're saying that because I've done certain roles, I can't possibly believe in the things I say I believe in. How is that not personal?" Sunny responds, "I'm saying that your actions need to match your words. And when you do a project that sexualizes women, or that presents women in a certain light, and then you turn around and talk about empowerment, people are going to question that. That's not me being unfair. That's just reality." Florence takes a deep breath, and you can see her trying to compose herself. She says, "First of all, I would argue that none of the projects I've done sexualize women in the way you're describing. They show women as full human beings, with sexuality, yes, but also with agency, with complexity, with depth. That's not the same thing as sex. And second, the idea that I can't explore certain themes or certain aspects of human experience in my work because it might send the wrong message is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps women in a box. Sunny shakes her head. She says, I'm not trying to put you in a box. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about responsibility. And I think you're avoiding the question. Florence's voice gets louder now. She says, I'm not avoiding anything. I'm telling you that the premise of your question is flawed. You're asking me to defend choices that don't need defending. I'm an artist. I make art. And if people don't like that art, they don't have to consume it. But this idea that I owe anyone an explanation for doing my job, that I need to make sure every single thing I do is palatable and appropriate for everyone, that's not realistic and it's not fair. Sunny fires back. But you're not just doing your job in a vacuum. You're doing it in front of millions of people. You have fans who are young, who are impressionable, who look at you and think, if Florence does it, it must be okay. Don't you feel any obligation to those people? Florence looks genuinely angry now. She says, no, I don't. And I know that sounds harsh, but I don't. Because if I start making choices based on what other people think I should do, based on what's safe or what's acceptable, then I'm not an artist anymore. I'm just a puppet. And I didn't get into this industry to be a puppet. The tension in the room is palpable at this point. The audience is dead silent. The other hosts are looking back and forth between Florence and Sunny like they're watching a tennis match. And Sunny, to her credit, doesn't back down. She says, so you're saying you have no responsibility to your fans at all? Florence responds immediately. She says, I'm saying my responsibility is to myself, to my craft, and to the truth of the stories I'm telling. If that disappoints people, I'm sorry, but I can't live my life trying to make everyone happy. That's not authentic. And authenticity is the one thing I'm not willing to compromise on. Sunny leans back and crosses her arms. She says, well, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with you on that. I think a lot of people are going to say that when you have the kind of platform you do have a responsibility. And choosing to ignore that responsibility is selfish. And that word, selfish, that's when everything really explodes. Florence's eyes widen. She says, selfish. You think I'm selfish because I won't censor myself to make other people comfortable. Do you hear yourself right now? Sunny doesn't flinch. She says, I think you're prioritizing your own artistic freedom over the well-being of the people who support you. And yes, I would call that selfish. Florence stands up from her chair. Not dramatically, but you can tell she's done. She says, I came here to talk about my work, not to be lectured about my moral failings by someone who doesn't know me. If this is the kind of conversation you want to have, you can have it without me. The studio goes completely silent. The producers are probably losing their minds. The other hosts are frozen. And Sunny just looks at her and says, so you're leaving? You're just going to walk away because you don't like being challenged. Florence looks her dead in the eye and says, I'm leaving because this stopped being a conversation and started being an attack. There's a difference. Sunny immediately responds, saying, Florence, sitting down and having a difficult conversation isn't an attack. This is what we do here. We ask hard questions. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing press. Florence stops. She's still standing, and you can see her jaw clench. She says, I can handle hard questions just fine. What I can't handle is someone twisting my words and misrepresenting who I am to prove a point. You're not interested in my answers. Sunny, you already decided what you think before I even sat down here. One of the other hosts finally manages to jump in. She says, okay, let's all just take a breath here. I think maybe we got a little heated and we can— But Florence cuts her off. She says, no, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I need to say this. Sunny, you started this conversation by asking me about criticism I've received. Fine, that's a fair question. But then you took it further. You implied that my work is harmful. You said I'm contradicting my own values. You called me selfish. Those aren't interview questions. Those are accusations. And I'm not going to sit here and defend myself against accusations that have no basis in reality. Sunny leans forward again and says, they have basis. Florence, there are articles written about this. There are people on social media talking about this. I didn't make this up. I'm bringing up concerns that exist in the public discourse. Florence's voice gets very measured, very controlled. She says, the public discourse, as you call it, is often driven by people who haven't seen the work they're criticizing. It's driven by headlines and sound bites and outrage. If you're basing your questions on that, then you're not actually interested in having a real conversation. You're interested in creating a moment, and congratulations, you've created one. Sunny looks genuinely offended now. She says, that is completely unfair. I watched your film. I did my research. I'm not some tabloid journalist trying to get a reaction out of you. I'm asking you substantive questions about the choices you make and the impact they have. Florence shakes her head. She says, you watched the film and your takeaway was that it sexualizes women. Did we watch the same movie? Because the film I made is about a woman reclaiming her own narrative, taking control of her own story. Yes, there's sexuality in it, because sexuality is part of human experience. But to reduce it to sexualization, to act like showing a woman being sexual is inherently problematic. That's regressive. That's the opposite of empowerment. Sunny counters, I'm not saying that showing sexuality is problematic. I'm saying that context matters. And when you're in a position of influence, the context is broader than just the film itself. It's about what message it sends to a culture that already objectifies women constantly. Florence throws her hands up. She says, so what do you want from me? Do you want me to only play nuns and librarians? Do you want me to cover myself head to toe and never explore any aspect of womanhood that might make someone uncomfortable? Because that's not realistic, and more importantly, it's not my job. My job is to tell stories that feel true, and sometimes true stories are messy. Sometimes they're uncomfortable. That's the point, Sunny responds. Your job is also to exist in the world, in this society, where women are fighting every single day for respect and equality. And when someone with your platform does something that could be seen as undermining that fight, yes, you're going to get questioned about it. That's part of being in the public eye. Florence's voice gets quieter, but somehow more intense. She says, I have spent my entire career fighting for respect and equality. I have turned down roles that I thought were demeaning. I have spoken out about pay disparity. I have called out sexism in this industry over and over again. So for you to sit here and suggest that I'm undermining anything, that I'm not aware of the world I exist in, that is insulting. You don't get to decide what feminism looks like for me. You don't get to tell me how to be a woman in this industry. Sunny doesn't back down. She says, I'm not telling you how to be a woman. I'm asking you to be accountable for your choices. There's a difference. Florence lets out a frustrated laugh. She says, accountable to who? To you, to Twitter. Two people who've already made up their minds about me based on a headline. I'm accountable to myself and to the people I work with. The directors, the writers, the other actors who trust me to bring their stories to life. That's where my accountability lies. Another host tries again to mediate. She says, I think what Sunny is trying to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sunny, is that there's a conversation happening in the culture about representation and responsibility. And as public figures, we're all part of that conversation whether we like it or not. Florence turns to her. She says, I understand that. I really do. But there's a way to have that conversation that doesn't involve questioning someone's integrity or their values. Sunny didn't ask me how I think about these issues. She didn't ask me what my process is or what considerations I make. She came at me with an agenda, and when I didn't give her the answer she wanted, she doubled down. Sunny interjects, I did not have an agenda. I had questions. Important questions. And instead of answering them thoughtfully, you got defensive and now you're trying to make me the villain here. Florence stares at her. She says, you made yourself the villain when you called me selfish. When you implied I don't care about my fans. When you suggested that my work is harmful. Those aren't neutral questions, Sunny, those are judgments. And yeah, when someone sits across from me and judges me without knowing me, I get defensive. Most people would. Sunny says, I do know you. I know what you put out into the world. I know what you say in interviews. I know what roles you choose. That's what I'm basing my questions on. Florence responds, you know my public persona? You don't know me. And the fact that you think those two things are the same is part of the problem. You're conflating the actress with the person. The art with the artist. And then you're holding me personally responsible for how people interpret art that involves dozens of other people. Do you not see how unfair that is? Sunny says, what I see is someone who doesn't want to take responsibility for the influence they have. And I think that's a problem. I think when you reach a certain level of fame, you have to accept that you're not just making art anymore. You're making statements, whether you intend to or not. Florence's face hardens. She says, then maybe the problem is with how we consume art. Maybe the problem is that we can't just let artists make art without turning everything into a political statement or a moral litmus test. Maybe the problem is that we expect celebrities to be perfect, to never make a choice that might be controversial or challenging. And then we wonder why everything feels so sanitized and safe. Sunny leans back and says, or maybe the problem is that some people want all the benefits of fame without any of the responsibility that comes with it. And that's the moment where Florence actually picks up her microphone pack and starts unclipping it. She says, I'm done. I came here in good faith, and this has been anything but good faith. You can spin this however you want, but I'm not going to sit here and be talked down to. The other hosts are scrambling now. One of them says, Florence, please, let's just take a minute. We can reset. Sunny, maybe we can move on to a different topic. But Sunny isn't letting it go. She says, Florence, if you walk out of here, you're proving my point. You're showing that you can't handle criticism. You're showing that when things get uncomfortable, you run. Florence stops unclipping her mic and looks directly at Sunny. She says, no, Sunny, if I walk out of here, I'm showing that I have boundaries. I'm showing that I won't be disrespected on national television. There's a difference between criticism and what you're doing right now. Criticism would be, I saw your film, and I had questions about this specific scene or this specific choice. What you're doing is using me as a punching bag for your own opinions about what women should or shouldn't do. And I don't have to participate in that, Sunny says. So anyone who disagrees with you is disrespecting you. That's a very convenient way to avoid accountability. Florence finishes, unclipping the mic and sets it on the table. She says, anyone who questions my values calls me selfish, and then acts like I'm the problem for pushing back. Yeah, I'd say that's disrespectful. You're not disagreeing with me, Sunny, you're attacking me. And I'm not required to sit here and take it just because you have a microphone and an audience. The audience is completely silent now. You could hear a pin drop. Sunny looks at the other hosts, then back at Florence, and she says, fine, if that's how you feel, then go. But don't be surprised when people talk about this. Don't be surprised when this becomes the story instead of your movie. Florence picks up her bag and says, let them talk. I'd rather be known for standing up for myself than for sitting quietly while someone tears me down. And you know what, Sunny, I actually used to respect you. I thought you were someone who asked tough questions but did it fairly. But this wasn't fair. This was you deciding who I am and then trying to make me fit into that narrative. So yeah, I'm leaving. Not because I can't handle criticism, but because I can recognize when someone isn't actually interested in hearing what I have to say. She starts to walk away from the table, and one of the producers is clearly trying to signal something to the hosts. Another host stands up and says, Florence, please, just give us one more minute. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Florence stops but doesn't sit back down. She says, there's no misunderstanding. Sunny asked me questions that weren't really questions. They were accusations wrapped in the guise of journalism. And when I tried to explain my perspective, she kept pushing the same narrative. I don't know what else you want me to say. Sunny stands up now too. She says, what I want you to say is that you understand that your choices have consequences. That's all. I'm not asking you to apologize for your work. I'm asking you to acknowledge that what you do matters, and it affects people. Florence turns around fully to face her. She says, of course, my work matters. Of course, it affects people. That's why I do it. But the way it affects people isn't my responsibility beyond the intention I put into it. I can't control how someone interprets a film. All I can do is be honest in the work and trust that people are smart enough to engage with it on their own terms. What you're asking me to do is anticipate every possible reaction and cater to the most conservative interpretation of my choices. That's not how art works. Sunny responds, maybe you need to be lectured. Maybe someone needs to tell you that the way you're approaching this is problematic, because clearly no one else in your circle is willing to say it. Florence's mouth drops open. She says, wow, okay, so now you're speaking for everyone in my life. You're assuming that no one around me challenges me or questions my choices. That's incredibly presumptuous. You don't know anything about my life or the conversations I have or the people I surround myself with. One of the other hosts says, ladies, I really think we need to bring the temperature down here. This has gotten way too heated, and I don't think either of you is really hearing the other anymore. Florence says, you're right. I'm not hearing her anymore, because all I'm hearing is judgment and condescension. Sunny has made it very clear what she thinks of me and my work, and I've made it very clear that I disagree. There's nothing left to say, Sunny says. There's plenty left to say. You just don't want to hear it because it challenges the narrative you've built for yourself. You want to be the fearless artist who doesn't care what anyone thinks, but the truth is, you do care. You're just mad that someone is finally calling you out. Florence steps closer to the table. She says, you didn't just ask questions. You made statements disguised as questions. You said my work is harmful. You said I'm selfish. You said I'm contradicting my values. Those aren't questions, Sunny. Those are your opinions, and you're entitled to your opinions. But you're not entitled to frame them as objective truth and then expect me to defend myself against them. Sunny says, fine, you want me to be direct. I think you're talented. I think you're smart, but I also think you're reckless with the platform you have. I think you prioritize shock value and edginess over responsibility. And I think you hide behind the label of artist to avoid accountability. There, is that direct enough for you? The other hosts look horrified. The audience gasps, and Florence just nods slowly. She says, thank you for your honesty. Now let me be honest with you. I think you're threatened by women who don't fit into your idea of what feminism should look like. I think you're uncomfortable with sexuality and with complexity, and so you try to police other women under the guise of protecting them. And I think you're using me as an example to make yourself feel superior. So yeah, I'm leaving. Not because I can't handle your opinion, but because your opinion is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I do. And life is too short to spend it arguing with people who have already made up their minds. She slings her bag over her shoulder and starts walking toward the exit. Sunny calls after her, you can walk away, Florence, but this conversation doesn't end just because you leave. People are still going to have questions. They're still going to want answers. Florence stops at the edge of the set. turns back one last time, and says, "Then let them ask. But next time, I'll make sure I'm talking to someone who actually wants to listen. Someone who sees an interview as a dialogue, not an interrogation. Good luck with the rest of your show." And with that, she walks off the set. The camera holds on the remaining hosts for a moment. They're clearly scrambling, trying to figure out how to transition. Sunny sits back down, and you can see she's processing what just happened. One of the hosts says something like, "Well, that was certainly unexpected. We'll be right back after this break." But the damage is done. The moment is captured, and within minutes, clips of the confrontation are going to be everywhere. Social media is going to explode with takes. Some people are going to side with Florence, saying she stood up for herself against an unfair attack. Others are going to side with Sunny, saying Florence couldn't handle legitimate criticism. The think pieces are going to write themselves. But here's the thing, regardless of whose side you're on, what just happened was a masterclass in two people who are both passionate about what they believe. Both intelligent, both articulate, completely failing to find common ground. It's a reminder that even when people theoretically want the same things, better representation, more thoughtful discourse, genuine equality, they can still end up in opposite corners, because they fundamentally disagree on how to get there. Florence wanted to be seen as an artist making bold choices. Sunny wanted accountability for those choices, and neither one was willing to bend. You can understand both perspectives. You can see where Florence is coming from, feeling like she's being judged unfairly for doing work she believes in. And you can see where Sunny is coming from, feeling like people with platforms need to be more conscious of their impact. But understanding both sides doesn't make them compatible. Sometimes two people are just going to clash, no matter how similar their end goals might be. So what do you think? Was Florence right to walk off, or should she have stayed and tried to work through it? Was Sunny asking fair questions, or did she cross a line? Drop a comment below and let me know where you stand on this, because I genuinely want to hear what you think. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more stories like this. Thanks for watching.